you for inviting me to be here today. Nabeel is not just on our mind, but he's also in our hearts. And it's painful to watch person after person having to spend so much time in prison cells for demanding something as basic as human rights, which should be something that is guaranteed by international universal law. I would start by saying, what's the main difference between Bahrain 2011 and Bahrain 2016? What we saw in Bahrain in 2011 was basically a knee-jerk reaction from a government facing a large amount of protests and protesters who were demanding freedom and democracy. And because it was a knee-jerk reaction, it was quite chaotic, it was out of control, and it garnered a lot of international attention. What's happened since then is, with the advice of definitely Western advisors, the Bahraini government has been very, very successful in institutionalizing the crackdown. That means that you no longer see the same scenes that you saw in the videos in regards to people being shot in the neck or people with half their heads missing. You do still see the protests and the attack on protesters, but those very graphic images from 2011, they've learned how to avoid that, to avoid international attention and international reaction. So instead, what they've done is they've depended on the judiciary to become the main tool of the crackdown, which is why per capita, Bahrain has the largest amount of prisoners in the Middle East and North Africa region. Mass incarceration. No people, no problem. So what you do is you put them in prisons. When the prisons don't fit, you build more prisons, which is exactly what they're doing right now. So you've heard from my colleagues about how the situation in Bahrain has gotten worse, how instead of reforms and change as was promised in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, the situation is actually getting worse, not better. But I don't want to talk to you about Bahrain and the Middle East. That's something that you probably hear in every speech you go to listen to, in every newspaper article you read. I want to talk to you about the West. Because in 2011 and 2012, if you asked me about the role of the UK, the EU, the US, or whoever when it comes to Bahrain, I would have said, well, they're turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to what's happening in the country. That's no longer the case. Today, they are actively enabling the Bahraini government. The Bahraini government would not be able to do what it does. It would not be able to continue doing what it does if it were not for its Western allies. And we saw in the movie how the UK and the US does this. They do it through economic deals. They do it through arms sales. We just saw a few days ago the leakage of the Clinton emails, where we found out that the Bahraini Crown Prince had donated millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation right before he had a meeting with Clinton as Secretary of State and received a deal for arms sales. Infuriating, right? But it's a reality. The same thing with the UK. The UK is even worse than the US when it comes to Bahrain. But the US is bad, but relatively to the UK, the US actually looks pretty good. Because when you look at the UK has actually said publicly that Bahrain is on a path of reform at a time when the human rights situation is getting worse on the ground, where the numbers of political prisoners is on the rise, not going below. And yet we continue to hear time after time about how, you know, the Western countries believe in human rights and democracy, that human rights and democracy are the cornerstone of the foreign policy of Western countries. But when it comes to actually doing something about human rights, there's a double standard. There's a double standard that depends on whether they like the person they're criticizing or not. Because when it comes to criticizing Bashar al-Assad, or when it comes to criticizing Iran, it's easy. They're more than happy to do it. And they should, because there are human rights violations. There are war crimes in places like Syria. But when it comes to the Gulf, suddenly, no. It's not about human rights anymore. Because we need to make sure that we can buy their oil. We need to make sure that we can sell them arms to keep our economies running. So suddenly, human rights, you know, take the back seat. You're not as important anymore. And the problem is that the situation is getting worse. When we look at 2012, 2013, when we had meetings with the UK government, with the US government, with the EU, at least they tried to pretend that they cared about human rights. You know, they would sit there and say, well, you know, we know the situation is bad in Bahrain. We know it's bad in the Gulf. We want to do better. Now they don't even try to do that. Now when you sit with the diplomats, they'll straight out say, security, terrorism, anti-radicalization, anti-extremism. Human rights, subject of yesterday. It's not the main issue anymore. And that's a trend that we've been seeing across Europe and the United States. When we see the rise of these right-wing governments in Denmark, in Norway, in Poland, across the board in Europe, we should all be very worried. Because yes, it's easy to sit in our seats here in Copenhagen and say, well, you know, human rights problems, that's a subject for the Middle East. We don't have human rights problems here in Europe. But that's actually not the case. Democracy only works if we're active. If we're active in protecting those rights that we know and think we have. And if we're not careful, those rights will be taken away from us. We're already seeing how our right to privacy is slowly being taken away from us. Our right to free expression. If you help refugees today here in Europe, you're considered as a human trafficker because you helped a refugee. So we have to be very wary of what's happening at home because we're not very far away from the Middle East. What I think is important for us to focus on sitting here in Copenhagen is Denmark. You know, we saw in the movie about the role that the US and the UK play. Well, what about Denmark? I would say Denmark was playing a great role in 2012. We saw how the minister very publicly went on a campaign to get the Danish citizen released from Bahraini prisons. It was a very long and very public campaign. Parts of it were private, but it actually created real pressure. Today, we're no longer seeing that. Instead, what we are seeing is a group of more than 100 people being sent to Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince and his wife to do economic deals. The country that we so happily hear in the media criticize as being anti-woman and living in the medieval ages. Well, what does it say about us if we're doing business with them? We can't have double standards on these things. There is no such thing as separating economics from politics or human rights. There's no such thing as separating sports from human rights. When sports is being used as a weapon like the Formula One to crack down on human rights, it's no longer separate, whether we like it or not. There's a Danish racer who actually takes part in the Formula One. Why are we not seeing more people being outspoken about that? When there's a Danish citizen sitting in a prison cell in Bahrain after having been severely tortured. And I'm not saying that the Danish citizen is the only one that matters, but he can definitely be used as a gateway to look at the human rights situation in the country. We're talking about thousands of political prisoners who did nothing but call for change, call for human rights and democracy. You know, remember what the West is saying is the cornerstone of their foreign policy. And yet we're okay with people sitting in prison cells for that. Suddenly it's very difficult for governments to put out a statement calling for Nabeel Rajab's release. Something that they used to do. You know, back in 2013, 2012, we used to say the problem is that there's no consistency. There isn't a continuation of strong statements on Bahrain. Now we say, where are those statements? Because they're not there anymore. I think that generally when we sit down and think about this, you know, we live so far away from Bahrain, from the Middle East, from everything that's happening, you know, way over there. And it's easy to become disconnected from the situation. But we have to remember that we lose a part of our humanity when we choose to not react when we see a human rights violation. Because today, even when we look at the, you know, the dialogue or the discourse on refugees, the rights of refugees, the amount of hate that we're seeing, if you read the comment sections, which I advise you not to do in newspapers, and you see all of the hate that is being spewed against refugees. And we don't remember that it was merely 60, 70 years ago during World War II, when it was European refugees going to North Africa, trying to escape from war and destruction. What if the Africans had reacted the way the people in Europe are reacting today? Things can change and things can change fast. And if something were to change here in Denmark tomorrow, wouldn't we want other people who knew what was happening to stand up and take a stand? To stand up and say, well, this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it. We always think that me as a person, I can't make a difference, I'm just one person. But that's actually not true. Every single person makes a difference. And to finish off, I'm going to share something with you that my father told me, who's serving a life sentence, as you heard, in Bahrain. And I remember I was going to give a speech to Amnesty students, and I asked him, do you have a message you'd like me to send to them? And he said, explain to them why every action they take matters. Sometimes being a human rights defender or being an activist or being someone who's in prison for merely tweeting or speaking out or protesting, it makes a difference of life and death to know that people on the outside care, that they know you're there, and that they're willing to speak out on your behalf. You know, the letter writing campaigns that Amnesty does, a lot of people say, well, what's the point? I'm writing a letter. What difference is that going to make? It makes a difference. When I was sitting in prison and I knew that people were protesting on the outside for me, it made a difference. And I remember my father told me that when after he was arrested and he was in the hospital after being tortured, he was at the point of basically breaking down. The torture was very severe and he was basically cut off from the entire world. And he doesn't know if it was a dream or if it was true. But he said that a nurse came and he was blindfolded, so he couldn't see anything. A nurse walked into his room and held his hand and said, "This too shall pass." And he said that's what got him through the night. That's the difference one person can make. And it's up to us to make a decision if we want to be that one person that makes a difference or just another person who doesn't. And at the end, it says more about us than them. And I don't think that we should be in a position where we feel sorry for human rights defenders. On the contrary, we should be proud of them. They're people who have chosen to make a difference. And if we choose to not stand by them, we should feel sorry for ourselves, nobody else. Thank you.